Have you ever noticed how the mind has a way of turning on itself? You could be sitting in a perfectly calm room, the world outside quiet, your life not on fire for once. And yet there it is. That one thought, that single irritating corrosive whisper in your head that says you're behind, that you're not doing enough, that someone else out there is living the life you should have had. It creeps in, digs deep, and before you know it, you're arguing with your own mind like a prisoner defending himself against a ghost judge. That's what toxic thoughts are. They're invisible dictators ruling your internal world, and if you don't learn how to dismantle them, they'll pull you away from everything that actually matters. Machiavelli understood something that few people grasp today. The greatest battlefield isn't a throne room or a war front, it's the mind. The same cunning he recommended to rulers can be used by anyone trying to reclaim control of their focus. Because in truth, toxic thoughts are like political opponents, clever, manipulative, and endlessly patient. They wait for the moment you let your guard down, then seize the narrative. The moment you allow one to settle in, resentment, jealousy, self-pity, it builds alliances. It gathers more of its kind until your whole mental state turns into a conspiracy against your own will. But here's the irony. These thoughts have no real power of their own. Their strength comes entirely from attention, your attention. Machiavelli would call that the consent of the governed. The more you argue with them, the more you feed them. The more you replay the same scenario in your mind, the more territory they claim. So, to delete toxic thoughts, you don't wrestle with them. You outmaneuver them. You turn their own power against them. Think of your mind like a court full of advisors, each one trying to influence your ruler, the conscious self. The toxic ones scream the loudest, but loud doesn't mean right. Machiavelli would say a wise prince listens, but decides in silence. That's the first step. Stop giving every thought the privilege of an audience. When a toxic idea appears, you're not good enough. You'll never make it. They're better than you. You don't have to debate it. You don't even have to reject it. You simply strip it of ceremony. Let it stand there unacknowledged, unengaged, like a messenger whose words never reach the throne. That silence is not weakness. It's strategy. Every moment you refuse to engage is a moment you're reasserting control. But silence alone isn't enough. The mind abhors a vacuum. You can't just delete a thought, you must replace it with a command. If you want to stay focused, you must appoint a stronger advisor. And that's where self-direction comes in. Machiavelli wrote that fortune favors those who act decisively. The same applies inwardly. When you sense your mind spiraling, shift from reaction to construction. Ask yourself, what can I do right now? That question turns you from a spectator of your own suffering into its architect, because the truth is most toxic thoughts don't survive contact with action. They thrive in imagination where they can stretch and exaggerate. But the moment you move, send the message, write the line, take the walk, they start to lose form. The act itself becomes a declaration. I choose movement over noise. And once you make that your habit, the internal war begins to change. The toxic voices stop expecting you to listen. They realize you've become immune to their theater. Still, there's a deeper layer here, one Machiavelli would appreciate. The cunning of toxic thoughts lies not in their negativity, but in their disguise. They rarely appear as bad thoughts. They often come dressed as truth, reason, or even wisdom. I'm just being realistic, you might say. I'm just preparing for the worst. But realism without courage is cowardice disguised as prudence. There's a thin line between being aware of danger and being hypnotized by it. Machiavelli would advise a ruler to be aware of enemies but never ruled by fear of them. Apply the same principle internally. Recognize the thought, measure its motive, and then decide whether it serves you or sabotages you. That's the discipline few ever master, the ability to think without believing. Most people are slaves to their own thoughts because they assume every thought that arises must mean something profound or true. But not every messenger deserves an audience, and not every thought is a prophecy. The disciplined mind can watch its own chaos without being consumed by it. It can say interesting and move on. That's real power, because the person who cannot separate thought from identity is like a ruler who can't tell the difference between friend and spy. And spies, mental or otherwise, must be handled with precision. You don't banish them with rage, you study them. Notice their timing. Do they appear when you're tired? When you're comparing yourself to others? When you're idle? Too long? That's your intelligence report. Once you know their pattern, you can anticipate their moves. This is how Machiavellian strategy translates to the mind, understanding what triggers internal sabotage and preempting it before it becomes rebellion. For instance, let's say you find yourself constantly distracted, checking your phone, scrolling endlessly, drifting. You tell yourself you lack discipline. But that's not the root. The real problem is fragmentation. Toxic thoughts fragment attention by scattering your sense of purpose. They whisper that focus is pointless unless it's perfect, or that others are already too far ahead. So why bother? This isn't laziness, it's psychological warfare. The enemy's goal is not to defeat you outright, but to divide your will until it governs nothing. And that's why focus must be treated not as a mood, but as an act of rule. You enforce it. You decide what deserves attention. Machiavelli would say a ruler must consolidate power before reforming the state. In the same way, before trying to become productive, consolidate your focus. Simplify. Guard your energy like territory. Every distraction you indulge is a treaty with weakness. Every small act of control, writing instead of scrolling, finishing a task without switching tabs, is a political victory in the empire of your mind. But here's where most people fail. They think deleting toxic thoughts means never feeling negativity again. That's impossible. Even Machiavelli knew that control is not about eliminating opposition, it's about governing it. The mind will always produce doubts, envy, resentment. These are not signs of failure, they're the cost of awareness. The key is to manage them without letting them rule. A great ruler doesn't silence all criticism. He filters it, learns from what's useful, discards what's poisonous. You can do the same internally. Let your negative thoughts speak only to the extent that they reveal what needs attention. Then dismiss them. Because when you stop reacting emotionally to every toxic impulse, something fascinating happens. The thought loses its weapon. It becomes data. You begin to see patterns when, how, and why certain thoughts appear, and suddenly what once felt like chaos becomes intelligence. And intelligence, once processed, turns into command. That's the transformation Machiavelli hinted at in all his writings. The shift from being a subject of your circumstances to being their strategist. And when you start to live this way, focus isn't something you chase anymore. It's something that naturally forms around clarity. You stop forcing discipline and start embodying it. You stop seeking motivation and start generating it. The noise fades not because the world got quieter, but because you stopped entertaining it. That's how rulers of the inner kingdom are made. Not through endless positivity, but through the ruthless, quiet art of mental governance. But even once you begin to govern your own mind, the war doesn't truly end. It just shifts terrain. The toxic thoughts you silenced earlier don't disappear forever. They evolve. They adapt to your new strength. At first, they came as blunt negativity. You're not enough now. They disguise themselves as ambition. You should be further ahead. That's the sophistication of the mind's resistance. It always wears the costume you least suspect. Machiavelli would warn any ruler that once the rebels are defeated, corruption often begins within the court. The same is true internally. Once the obvious weaknesses are subdued, the subtle ones rise in their place. This is why staying focused isn't a one-time act. It's a daily act of political maintenance. The court of your mind must be cleaned constantly because even the most loyal thoughts can turn against you if left unchecked. For example, that drive to improve yourself. It's noble until it becomes obsession. That desire to win. Useful until it becomes envy. Every strength, when unbalanced, becomes its opposite. And that's how toxicity returns not as poison, but as excess. The skill, then, is moderation not in the soft moral sense, but as strategy. A ruler who overreacts to every threat eventually becomes the threat himself. Likewise, a person who overthinks every mental impulse becomes trapped by their own vigilance. There's a point where too much self-analysis becomes self-sabotage. You don't need to control every thought. You only need to maintain order. Think of it like managing a city. You don't chase every whisper in the alleyway. You strengthen the laws that keep chaos contained. To stay focused, you must decide what laws govern your internal state. What will you tolerate and what will you not? If your mind is the state, your attention is law enforcement. Every time you redirect focus, you're policing the borders. Every time you let your mind wander into comparison or resentment, you're leaving the gates open. Focus isn't something mystical, it's infrastructure. It's built through consistent patterns of where you choose to look, what you choose to repeat, and what you refuse to dwell on. But make no mistake, deleting toxic thoughts doesn't mean pretending you're unaffected. It means you become emotionally sovereign. You can experience pain, failure, even betrayal without collapsing into victimhood. That's the real meaning of Machiavellian resilience. Not emotional numbness, but composure, the ability to process the storm without becoming it. When your focus is strong, emotion becomes fuel instead of fire. Anger becomes energy. Doubt becomes data. Fear becomes foresight. This requires training, and the first arena is attention. Machiavelli said, "A wise ruler must constantly study both fortune and misfortune to learn from them. You must do the same with your thoughts. Watch them not as truths, but as movements. Which thoughts expand your power and which drain it, which strengthen your discipline and which scatter it." Over time, you'll start noticing patterns, small but consistent ones, like how certain environments always trigger distraction, how certain people awaken old insecurities, how certain times of day invite mental weakness. Those are not coincidences. They are recurring invasions. And once you recognize them, you can prepare defense in advance. One of the simplest yet most overlooked tactics is to structure your environment so it supports clarity. Because no matter how strong your internal rule is, if your surroundings are in rebellion, the mind will follow. A cluttered space breeds a cluttered mind. Endless notifications are like insurgent whispers undermining your command. You can't rule your inner world while allowing chaos in your outer one. Control begins with what you permit around you. Machiavelli would advise a ruler to keep his circle small and loyal, not because he feared betrayal, but because he valued influence. The more voices around you, the harder it becomes to discern your own. In the modern world, your circle includes your feeds, your habits, the voices you let into. Your attention. Every scroll, every click, every conversation is a vote for the kind of mind you'll have tomorrow. So ask yourself, who and what gets to shape your focus? Are you surrounded by clarity or noise? Once you start eliminating what drains you, you'll notice something peculiar. The mind resists peace. It craves stimulation the way a corrupted state craves conflict. Silence feels uncomfortable because for the first time the toxic machinery has stopped spinning. Don't mistake that unease for boredom. It's withdrawal. Your mind has been addicted to distraction. The cure is not to fill the silence, but to sit inside it long enough for clarity to surface. Machiavelli wrote that the prince must often isolate himself to think clearly, to plan without interference. The same solitude that strengthens rulers strengthens thinkers. Not every moment of silence must be filled with input. Sometimes the most productive act is to let the mind breathe. Still, discipline doesn't come from silence alone. It comes from friction. To stay focused, you must deliberately create boundaries that test you. When you decide to work without checking your phone for an hour, you're not just practicing willpower. You're staging a coup against internal chaos. Every act of restraint is a symbolic declaration of power. Over time, those declarations accumulate. You begin to identify not with your impulses, but with your control of them. That shift from reacting to ruling is where toxicity begins to die. But here's the hidden cost of deleting toxic thoughts. You lose a certain comfort. Negativity, as destructive as it is, gives the illusion of familiarity. It tells you who to blame. It offers excuses. It lets you avoid the terror of responsibility. Once you remove it, you're left staring at a blank mental canvas, and that emptiness can feel unbearable. Many people relapse into toxicity not because they enjoy suffering, but because it gives their chaos meaning. That's why staying focused is harder than it looks. It demands that you build new meaning deliberately, and meaning can't just be adopted. It must be constructed. You build it through action, through small daily victories that prove to your mind that control is real, not conceptual. This is why Machiavelli valued results over intentions. He knew that the mind respects evidence, not promises. Each time you keep a commitment to yourself, no matter how small, you're rewriting your mental constitution. You're teaching your mind to obey your commands, not its old fears. Of course, there will be setbacks. Days when the toxic thoughts return louder than ever, when the focus shatters and you feel like you've lost progress. But here's the truth. That's part of the strategy. Every rebellion tests the strength of a ruler's regime. The fact that these thoughts still try to overthrow you means you've built something worth overthrowing. Don't interpret relapse as failure. See it as proof that the mind recognizes your authority and is struggling against it. The goal is not to eliminate the noise forever, but to reduce its influence over time until it becomes background static, irrelevant, and powerless. The higher you rise in self-control, the subtler your enemies become. You'll start to notice toxic thoughts appearing as questions instead of accusations. They'll whisper, "Are you sure this is worth it? Or maybe you should take it easy." It's not evil, it's comfort trying to reclaim the throne. And that's when you must remember Machiavelli's ultimate rule. A ruler must appear merciful, but act decisively. You can acknowledge the thought without letting it sway you. You nod, you smile, and then you execute your plan anyway. Focus at its core is rebellion against distraction. It's not a natural state, it's an earned one. The mind is not designed to serve one purpose for long. It drifts, it wanders, it seeks novelty. But just as a state can be unified by vision, so can the mind. And that vision doesn't come from wishing. It comes from ruling, from deciding what deserves your energy and cutting away what doesn't. No matter how familiar or emotionally satisfying the distraction might be, in the end, what destroys most people isn't the world's hostility, but their own unmanaged thoughts. The true Machiavellian act is not conquering others, it's mastering the empire within. Because once you do that, every external challenge becomes negotiable. You stop chasing motivation. You stop fearing failure. You stop getting derailed by every passing emotion. You realize the mind is a servant, not a tyrant. And the moment you rule it with clarity and consistency, it finally obeys. And when it does obey, when the noise inside your mind finally quiets down, you begin to notice something you couldn't before. How much energy you were wasting just fighting yourself. The endless debates, the overthinking, the self-doubt. They were consuming more power than any external obstacle ever could. It's like suddenly realizing that half your army was fighting on the wrong side all along. Once they stand down, everything becomes lighter. You see decisions clearly. You act without dragging the weight of hesitation behind you. That's what mental freedom actually feels like. Not the absence of thought, but the alignment of thought and will. But staying in that state is the real test. It's easy to feel clear for a day or two. The real challenge is to maintain it when life throws its chaos at you again. Machiavelli would say the state must be maintained through both fear and love, not in the emotional sense, but as balance. Fear represents awareness of consequences. Love represents belief in your purpose. You need both. Too much fear and you paralyze yourself. Too much love and you lose caution. The mind is no different. You must rule it through balance, firm but fair, aware but unafraid. Toxic thoughts often return not because they're powerful, but because you forget your position. You start to identify with them again, thinking, "This is just how I am." But no, that's not you. That's residue. A remnant of an older regime trying to reclaim control. You have to remind yourself that thoughts are not commands. They're visitors. They come and go. You decide who stays. The act of reminding yourself is like renewing a decree. I decide what this mind focuses on. Repeat that enough and it becomes law. Now you might wonder, what's the point of all this control? Isn't that exhausting? It can be at first, but the goal isn't to constantly police your thoughts. It's to build a system so strong that order becomes automatic. In the beginning, focus requires effort. Later, it becomes identity. Machiavelli would compare it to fortifying a city. The first construction is hard labor, but once the walls are built, the city protects itself. That's the stage you're aiming for, to turn discipline into defense. And one of the most powerful fortifications you can build is perspective. Toxic thoughts thrive on smallness, on zooming in so close to a problem that it looks like your entire world. When you pull back and see the larger game, the thought loses scale. For example, a setback in your work feels devastating when it's your only point of focus. But if you zoom out, see it as one battle in a decade-long campaign, it becomes manageable. Machiavelli constantly reminded rulers to think long-term, to see beyond the current crisis. Apply that to yourself. Most toxic thoughts dissolve not because you solved them, but because you outgrew their frame. Sometimes the most Machiavellian move is patience, the ability to wait without decaying. Toxic thoughts often demand immediate reaction. They want you to panic, fix, explain. But if you wait, If you let the emotional wave crash without moving, you see how hollow they actually are. The mind, when unprovoked, tends to heal itself. Silence, stillness, distance. These are your hidden weapons. You can't out-argue a toxic thought, but you can outlast it. There's also the question of identity. Many toxic thoughts survive because they hide within the stories you tell yourself. I'm just not disciplined. I always lose focus. These are not thoughts anymore. They're self-concepts reinforced through repetition. To delete them, you can't just reject them. You have to replace them with new evidence. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler must constantly demonstrate strength, not just possess it. The same rule applies to your mind. You don't become focused by believing you are. You become focused by acting like you are consistently enough that belief follows. Action reforms identity. So when you wake up tomorrow and that old mental poison starts whispering again about your failures, your inadequacies, don't try to outthink it. Outbehave it. Move. Do something constructive, however small. That movement is your proof of rule. Every act of progress, no matter how minor, is a public execution of doubt. And over time, your mind takes notice. It begins to respect its ruler. But respect fades if you stop showing authority. Machiavelli warned that power once obtained must be maintained through presence. You can't disappear and expect loyalty to hold. The same applies internally. You can't neglect self-awareness and expect mental order to remain. You must stay involved in the governance of your mind, not obsessively, but attentively. When you feel chaos creeping back in, return to your principles. What serves my focus, and what steals it? Ask that honestly, and you'll always find your way back. Let's be honest. Deleting toxic thoughts isn't a clean process. It's messy, uncomfortable, full of relapse. Sometimes you'll think you've overcome something only to find it resurfacing stronger later. That's not regression, it's exposure. The deeper layers revealing themselves as your awareness sharpens. Machiavelli said, "Fortune is like a river. It floods when neglected but can be controlled when prepared for. Your emotions work the same way. If you ignore them, they overwhelm you. If you study them, you can redirect their force." And here's something people rarely talk about. Focus itself can become toxic when it turns rigid, obsessive, punishing. When your pursuit of control starts breeding anxiety instead of clarity, you begin to fear imperfection. To see every slip as failure, that's not mastery. That's tyranny. A wise ruler governs firmly, but allows flexibility. You must learn when to let go, when to rest, when to allow chaos to exist without feeling defeated by it. True focus isn't tension, it's flow. You guide the mind like a steady current, not a clenched fist. Once you reach that level, something incredible happens. Toxic thoughts still appear, but you start greeting them with amusement rather than fear. They become familiar visitors, predictable, powerless. You recognize them instantly. Here's the one about failure again. Late as usual. You acknowledge them, but they no longer anchor you. That's liberation. The mind becomes transparent. Thoughts pass through it without residue. At that point, you begin to understand Machiavelli's deeper wisdom. Control isn't about domination. It's about direction. You can't stop the wind, but you can adjust your sails. The mind will never be perfectly still, but it can be perfectly steered, and the one who learns to steer it, to delete the unworthy thoughts, to channel energy where it matters, builds a kind of quiet power that no chaos can shake. In the end, deleting toxic thoughts and staying focused is not about becoming some flawless version of yourself. It's about becoming sovereign again, about reclaiming what was always yours. The ability to decide how you think, how you feel, how you act. That's not enlightenment, it's leadership. The same kind Machiavelli wrote about. Only now the kingdom is your own mind, and when you learn to rule it well, the world outside follows naturally. Because no matter how unpredictable fortune becomes, no matter how loud the noise gets, the ruler within remains unmoved, clear, calm, and quietly in control.